Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm so glad you've come here to join us online. We gather now today to explore one of the most, I think, emotionally fraught areas of bioethics, the intersection of profound longing and powerful technology. The writer Frederick Buechner described vocation as the place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. For couples facing infertility, the deep gladness they seek, the gift of a child, seems perpetually out of reach. And into that space of longing steps technology, offering not just help, but promises, not just assistance, but apparent solutions. Stephanie Gray Connors has built her career on a simple but radical commitment to communicate truth with love, to challenge comfortable assumptions with uncomfortable questions, and to invite people toward more beautiful answers than the ones our culture defaults to. The philosopher Leon Kass asked, how can we learn to value what is not instrumental? This is the heart of today's question. IVF approaches conception instrumentally as a problem to be solved, a product to be produced, a process to be engineered. But is a child ever rightly understood as a product? Can the longing for parenthood, however profound, justify any means of fulfilling it? Stephanie will not minimize the pain of infertility. She will not judge those who have turned to IVF in their desperation for a child. But she will ask us to look clearly at what happens when we concede to making what we cannot conceive, when we separate reproduction from relationship, when we create multiple embryonic human lives, knowing that not all will survive. The title of her book on this subject is simply On IVF, a preposition that suggests not standing against something, but standing above it, taking the long view, seeing it whole. And this is what we will do together this afternoon. So for those of you online, please welcome Stephanie Gray Connors.
Thank you so much. And nice summary of points there, Nicole. We could just take several of those things and just say, well, there we go. We have everything in a nutshell. But I will expound upon Nicole's beautiful introduction, which I appreciate. First of all, I want to identify that I have no conflicts to disclose in giving this presentation. And I did want to kind of briefly run through the learning objectives before we unpack them and dive deeper into the subject. The first thing that I'm going to accomplish in this presentation is to really analyze what is this ethical tension, this deep and profound human longing for parenthood, which is ordered, which is very good, and which I would say every human is called to. And the tension between that and the response being to commodify the human person, to take a technology not to aid the creation of life, but to actually make the creation of life. The second thing I'm going to do is really evaluate the nature of IVF and how it diminishes the human encounter, particularly in the family setting and in the context of the parent-child relationship, and therefore doesn't lead to human flourishing, which is what we all long for at the end of the day. And then I want to assess the implications of the very nature of how IVF works, particularly its practices on embryos in terms of, grading them, labeling them as being viable or not, therefore disposing those who are considered disabled, and the effect then that has on a lack of acceptance towards the human person in general and diversity in the human family. So in terms of this title, the longing to conceive, but then conceding to make, that's really, what's at issue here is this desire for children. And when it can't be fulfilled, what we would say naturally, then turning to technology to manufacture or make one's offspring. And if you look to the news, it seems that every day there is a new headline about IVF and about people who have pursued IVF. And there are the stories that make the news that involve famous people, people like Paris Hilton, who pursued not only IVF, but surrogacy and had two children in less than a year using two surrogates who were gestating at one point in overlapping time. And she made reference, so she had a boy and a girl in terms of brought to term, but she made reference at one point to having 20 boy embryos. So we're left with the question, what has become of those 20 boy embryos? And then there's headlines that involve, recently there was originally a couple originally from China that were found living in the United States that had basically created a IVF surrogacy regime where they had created more than 20 children using surrogates. They were living in their home, and then there was cases of alleged abuse. There have been other headlines where, there have been homosexual couples that have pursued IVF and surrogacy, and then one of the partners, for example, has been found to be a registered sex offender. So we can see these headlines, we can read these stories, and we can have, that ick factor of, oh my goodness, that seems wrong. But then there are the stories that don't make the news, but they make our lives because they're very personal and they're in our social circles. They are the stories of our family members, our friends, our fellow churchgoers, our colleagues who have faced the very heavy cross of infertility and have pursued IVF. Typically, these are couples that are married, that love each other, and often are from a faith background, and they want to fulfill the very first command they believe God gave humans, which was to be fruitful and multiply. So if we set aside the more shocking headlines that make the news, how ought we respond in those types of circumstances with the people we know who have faced infertility? And so what I'm going to be presenting today is that in terms of how we ought to think about IVF, ethically, I'm going to make the case that it is an immoral approach to solve an understandable problem of infertility. There are alternatives to IVF, which I will expound upon at the end. But before unpacking why I would argue IVF is an unethical or immoral approach to responding to infertility, I think it is important to address two very important points. The first is those who live with the suffering of infertility and those who have been created as a result of IVF. When someone like me is morally or ethically critical of IVF, those who suffer with infertility might feel like my claims are a stab in their heart because they naturally long for children. And as has been mentioned, that is a very ordered desire. It is very good to desire children, and it is within our nature from puberty to menopause to be able to conceive, so that if one isn't able to conceive in that decades-long time period, we can rightly come to the conclusion something has gone wrong. The question simply is, what's the ethical solution to what has gone wrong? And we want to acknowledge the pain of infertility, but not simply say, as a result of that pain, we can justify doing just anything in response. One of the points that I make in my book and use various stories to illustrate this is about various people who are friends of mine who have carried that cross of infertility. Some of them ultimately conceived, some of them didn't. Some of them pursued alternatives like adoption and fostering. Others didn't. But what was generally and clearly a common theme amongst all the people I interviewed was how painful it was to not be able to get pregnant, and how constantly they were reminded every time they left their home and they were in social settings and community groups and church gatherings, they could see families, they could see babies, and it deeply wounded them to not be able to achieve that. And so out of the gate, I think when making an ethical analysis of an issue that's deeply personal, it's important to validate the feelings of suffering that is infertility and the goodness of the deep desire for children. The second point that I think is important to make before diving into the debate is the value of the children conceived by IVF. Because someone like me, who's morally critical of IVF, a person who hears that, who was conceived that way, might say, so you're saying if IVF shouldn't have happened, that I shouldn't exist. And the point that I think is really important to emphasize is that at the end of the day, human beings have dignity. We are valuable, we are unrepeatable and irreplaceable, and our value is grounded in who we are not features or qualities about us, including how we were conceived. That my dignity and my worth is in being a unique member of the human family. It is not in how I came to be. And the reality is, I can say as a person of faith, there are various ways someone could come into existence that I don't agree with. Sex outside of marriage is something that I morally object to. So, for example, if someone was conceived as the result of a hookup, I would object to the circumstances of their conception, but I would not object to them. As a person of faith, for example, I would say the God I believe in is so powerful that he can take that which is unethical or immoral, the sins that humans commit, and he can draw good out of that unethical thing. It doesn't make the unethical thing good. It makes God good, that he can take good out of bad. So one of the good that can come from a bad is the unrepeatable, irreplaceable individual conceived, for example, as a result of a hookup. Or I think of my friend Ryan Baumberger. Some of you might be familiar with him. He's a wonderful pro-life speaker. He was conceived as a result of rape. Clearly, I condemn the circumstances of his conception, as does he. If we could go back in history and undo the evil of the sexual violence that occurred, we would do that. But we have no capability of going back in history and undoing actions. So therefore, we say, as much as the circumstances of his conception were evil, since we cannot undo them, the good that came from that evil was Ryan. And so in the same way, then, analogously, it is very possible to conclude that IVF is morally evil, that it is wrong, and yet the people conceived by IVF are as valuable as my friend Ryan, as someone conceived in a hookup, or as someone conceived through the loving embrace of a married couple. So having kind of prefaced all my remarks with those 2 points, we now need to look at, okay, why would someone like me argue that IVF is unethical? Briefly, I'm going to look at how IVF works, which is an important foundation to understand why it's ethically problematic. I'm going to do it really briefly because you're a medical audience, and I assume there's generally an understanding of IVF. But simply, in vitro fertilization is that the fertilization, that process is happening in glass, in a petri dish, in a lab, instead of in the mother's body. And so therefore, sperm have to be obtained, typically through an act of masturbation, although it would be possible for a couple to use a condom or a perforated condom and provide the sperm sample after having sexual intimacy together. In most cases, however, in the case of IVF, it is most typical for an act of masturbation to be done for the sperm to be obtained. Then eggs have to be obtained. So a woman is given injections of medicine that cause her ovaries to hyperstimulate. So instead of releasing one egg, they release 5, 10, 15, or 20. Those eggs are then extracted from her, and then in the lab, the sperm and the egg are put together. Sometimes those are the gametes of a married couple. Other times it is the gamete of maybe the wife, but not the husband, and they use a sperm cellar. Or alternatively, it's the husband's sperm, but they use an egg cellar to obtain eggs. Or it's a male homosexual couple, and a woman's eggs are used, and one of the partner's sperm is used. So you can have all kinds of mixings and things that can occur. But the point is, sperm and egg are obtained, and a third party external to the relationship manufactures or puts those parts together. So why then would I say that's ethically problematic? For the following reasons. IVF jeopardizes human life. IVF kills human life. The third point is IVF dehumanizes or commodifies the human person. And finally, IVF manufactures the human person. So then I want to kind of break down each of these, how it jeopardizes life, how it kills life, how it dehumanizes and commodifies life, and then ultimately what I think is really the foundation or the core of my position is that it manufactures a human person. So in terms of jeopardizing human life, it was all over the news, and I know it made it into Canada and really all over the world. Just in the last couple of years in the state of Alabama, there was the big court case about a fertility clinic where somehow, and I always find the practicalities of how this occurred bizarre to me, but a patient managed to wander in a fertility clinic storage room where the embryos were being stored, and for some reason decided to put their hand, in the container where embryos were stored, and they pulled out what was containing several frozen embryos. Obviously, their hand got cold, and so they dropped the frozen embryos, smashing the vial. And so the parents of these children were then suing their fertility clinic for the fact that their children were destroyed, which then opened a massive debate about, are they actually children and should they be treated as children? And when the courts came down and said, yes, these embryos ought to be considered children, just like a child in the womb or just like a child outside the womb, then there was all this fear of what are the implications of this for IVF clinics if indeed these are children like everyone else. But the point of this reference is that the very nature of keeping the youngest of our kind in storage tubes, in vats, in a lab, jeopardizes their life. There is a risk that someone could walk in and drop some humans. But even if you took, care to try to prevent that from happening, there's always a risk that someone in the clinic themselves, while transporting a petri dish somewhere else or the little tube into the freezer, that they trip and fall, and actual human beings will lose their lives. Then there's the reality of many embryos being frozen in the process of IVF. So if, for example, 20 embryos are made, not all 20 will be inserted in the woman's body. So let's imagine 2 are inserted in the woman's body. Then they might evaluate the 18 that are remaining and say, well, let's freeze, let's say 5. Or just to have some even numbers, let's say they'll freeze 8 so that, 10 will be disposed of. But of the 8 that are frozen, will they ever be thawed? And if they will be thawed, will their lives be guaranteed to be protected? Not necessarily. If you look at various reports on different IVF clinics, one clinic I read said that they had an 80 to 90% success rate with the freeze thaw process, so that if the couple went back for 1 or 2 or more of their 8 embryos that they froze, 80 to 90% would survive that process. But that means 10 to 20% won't. So these are human lives whose lives are in danger. They're jeopardized just by the very nature of how IVF occurs. Other clinics I've read say they have a 95% success rate, but even a 95% success rate forces us to ask the question, well, what about the 5%? What if there are some embryos that are yours that are in that 5%? Their lives, therefore, are jeopardized by being frozen. And so we have then this situation where we have, for example, some reports say in the United States alone, 1 million embryos frozen right now in just this country, this being where I am right now. And so we have to think, well, what will be the fate of these embryos? How many of them will ever come to be given the chance of growing through a pregnancy and being born? The other reason we should be concerned ethically about IVF is not simply that it jeopardizes human life, but it most directly and intentionally kills human life. And that can sometimes be a hard pill for some people to swallow when their desire is for children. And when on the surface, it seems like, look, I'm not wanting to end life. I'm wanting to create life. I can't create life. That's why I'm pursuing IVF. It seems to me that that's a very pro-life thing, someone might say. And so then we want to ask the question, well, how many children are created for one child to be brought to term? And of the other children that are created, how many of them are intentionally destroyed? So given that it's very common to have 5, 10, 15, or 20 embryos created, it is, in most cases, the fact that only a few will ever even make it to being inserted in the mother's body, let alone possibly be brought to term, because there's no guarantee after insertion that the embryo will successfully implant and grow to term. So if you have 20 embryos created, 2 inserted in the first round that successfully implant and grow as fraternal twins and are born, you have 18 other human beings who are likely to lose their lives. Some of them will lose their lives right away because in the lab, they will be put through genetic testing and will be determined to not be good enough quality to be inserted or to be frozen. So they will be destroyed right away. These are actual human beings. So they are being killed in the lab. But then there's other ways that human beings can be killed through IVF. One of the ways is through selective reduction, where in some cases, this is less common now, but it can still occur. More embryos are inserted than would safely or reasonably be considered to be the number of babies that should be in a pregnancy, with the idea that if we, insert 4 embryos, the odds are only one, if we're lucky, is going to implant. So therefore, let's try to increase the odds of implantation. But what if all 4 embryos inserted actually implant? And what if 1 or 2 of them before implantation split into identical twins? So that of the 4 inserted, 2 have become identical twins. So we actually have 6 humans in this woman's body. Well, if she's part of a selective reduction program, what the doctors would do is say, as the pregnancy progresses, we will selectively reduce, which is code word for abortion, down to maybe 2 instead of the original 6, to increase the odds of a safe pregnancy and your baby's coming to term. But then that means not only are some babies killed in the lab, but we now have some babies that are killed in the womb because we just inserted too many. The other way we have direct killing within the world of IVF is when parents opt for abortion later because it's determined later that the child has some form of genetic anomaly that wasn't discovered in the pre-implantation genetic testing. And so there have been cases where couples have desperately longed for children, pursued rounds of IVF that failed, ultimately had a successful insertion, implantation, pregnancy progresses, and about halfway through the pregnancy, they discover the baby has Down syndrome. And because the child does not have the chromosome number that they wanted, they now want an abortion. And there have been cases, you can see this online, where couples have pursued the direct killing of now a later term baby as a result of abortion. And you can even see this in the world of surrogacy. There was one company I saw online advertising. I think it offered around $65,000 for a surrogate to carry a pregnancy to term. But one of the conditions they outlined was if the couple hiring the surrogate decide that they don't want the pregnancy to continue, perhaps for a reason of genetic anomaly or some other reason, that the surrogate would be paid $10,000 to have an abortion. So she wouldn't walk away with her 65K, but she would at least get 10 for having an abortion. So if you look at just the numbers, that in 40 years globally, it's been estimated that 9.8 to 13 million children have been born as a result of IVF. Let's just take the number 10 million to keep it simple in our minds. If 10 million children have been born by IVF, but with each of those children, not just the one child was made in a lab, but 5, 10, or 15 of their siblings were also made, but not been yet brought to term, if at all, through IVF. Then there's tens of millions of human beings who have been directly killed in order to bring some human beings into existence. So why then should we be ethically concerned about IVF? It jeopardizes human life. It kills human life. And then as this relates to the parent-child relationship, this is very significant because we have to ask ourselves, who are these embryos? And they are children of someone. Sometimes they aren't the child of the woman whose body they're in the case of surrogacy. But the point is they are someone's child. And so we want to ask ourselves is, what should the parent-child relationship look like? From the perspective of a civil society, what does it think the parent-child relationship should look like? And inevitably, people would say, well, parents ought to protect their children, nurture their children, love their children, which is willing the child's good. And although people might think, well, I'm protecting, I'm nurturing, and I'm loving this child here that I created by IVF, if there's a whole bunch of children over here whose goodness has not been willed, who haven't been protected, who haven't been nurtured, then that really goes against the very nature of what civil societies expect of parents. The third reason why I would say we ought to object to IVF is that it dehumanizes and commodifies the human person. So you can look, for example, that when embryos are made in the lab, typically they are subjected to grading. So you can think like a student does a paper and they maybe get an A+ or a B-. And that's how these embryos are graded. A friend of mine, her sister-in-law pursued IVF. And when she talked about the embryos they attempted to have inserted and only one successfully implanted, and then the other ones failed. And then she talked about the one left she had in the freezer. And my friend had said, do you think you'll ever go back for that embryo? And she made this flippant remark like, well, it's a C minus. So I don't know if we'll go back for a C minus. Now, not everyone who pursues IVF might have that attitude, might in their regular talk of what they've done speak in the terms that the clinic does about their embryo, but some people do. And regardless of whether it's just the clinic that talks about the embryo that way or whether the parents talk about the embryo that way, we have to ask ourselves, do we grade our born children? Do we refer to our 5-year-old as an A+ kid, but the 7-year-old siblings kind of a C minus? We don't do that. Even if a child has challenges, even if, whatever the case may be, we believe that we ought not put labels on the human person that are dehumanizing. And that is what is happening in the world of IVF. With eugenics, the fact that these embryos are subjected to genetic testing, if they're not considered fit enough genetically, well, they're discarded, which means they are destroyed. And then, there are people that pursue genetic testing of embryos because they're thinking, well, we have a certain family condition that's going to cause a lot of medical problems, and we don't want to pass that along. Then there are people that just pursue genetic testing because they prefer a child with a certain eye color, a certain hair color, a certain gender. It's very interesting that if you look in the world historically, various cultures where there has been a preference for male children, there's now a male-female imbalance in countries like India or China, especially in places where, like in China, there's been a one-child policy for many decades. And so where you can only have one kid in that culture that prefers male children, you now have many more men than women because the baby girls were subjected to infanticide or abortion. My point is, what's interesting now is that in the world of IVF, you can see various articles online about how there's actually more of a preference for female babies than male babies. And I recently read a disturbing article. I can't remember the site. It might have been Slate, but I don't remember exactly. But it was talking about people wanting girl babies through IVF and never boy babies. And there were some very vicious comments from some women that were like, I would never want an effing boy. And just this attitude of repulsion towards having a boy. And I think we should be concerned about that, as we were and are concerned about historically a repulsion towards having a girl. But there's this attitude of, well, if I can make something, then that something's a commodity. And if it's a commodity, well, I want it to deliver. And if it doesn't give me what I want, well, then I'm going to return it or I'm going to replace it. But we ought not treat the human person that way. And yet we see this happening all kinds of ways in IVF, not only with the grading of embryos, not only with, different genetic testing that is done, but even with the exchange of money that occurs. Now, I realize in some places, in Canada might be one of them, there are laws that say you cannot sell your sperm or your egg or your body in the case of surrogacy. In other countries, you absolutely can do that. And certainly the United States is one such country where it is very profitable to get involved in selling your sperm, your eggs, or your embryos. Or your body, yeah, or your embryos as well as your body to gestate those embryos. I remember during COVID reading online that there was a fertility clinic saying, are you hitting financial hard times during this season of the COVID epidemic? Well, we have a solution for you. Become, they said sperm donor, but clearly you were becoming a sperm seller because they were like, you could earn $1,500 extra a month just by selling your sperm. And if you get a friend to get into the program as well, we'll give you an extra $500 bonus for bringing on another client for us. When women sell their eggs, that can be more profitable because it is more difficult to extract them and it is done less frequently than sperm selling would be done. So there have been some places where they offer women $10,000 just for one cycle round of extracting their eggs. selling your body to gestate a child in surrogacy. There are some things I've seen online that talk about $65,000 just to be a surrogate. So we have turned the creation of life, the gestating of life, very much into a money-making endeavor. There's another aspect of the use of the human person, the kind of the dehumanizing nature of IVF that a lot of times gets overlooked, which is the use of pornography in IVF clinics for obtaining the sperm sample. And there have now been various studies coming out about, IVF clinics provide pornography and then they study which porn is the most popular porn being used and then provide more of that. And it's very troubling, the categories and types of porn that is being used to obtain the gamete that is an integral part of the body of another human being who's not coming then into existence between a one flesh union of love between two people who have committed themselves to each other for life, but instead is coming into existence through one person getting sexually aroused, as a result of staring at nameless strangers who they are using for a certain end, whether the person participating in the porn agrees they're being used or not, they're nonetheless still being used. So there's much more I could say on that, but what I want to do is move to my last point and then talk about alternatives and then open it up to questions. So far then, to summarize why we should be ethically concerned about IVF, even though we want to have great compassion for those suffering with infertility and therefore have an alternative, which I will speak of in a moment, even though we want to value the dignity of the people conceived by IVF, we want to simply make the point, look, it jeopardizes human life, it kills human life, and it really commodifies human beings and dehumanizes them. But at the end of the day, I would say foundationally, we ought to be ethically concerned about IVF because it manufactures a human person who is a subject, not an object. And because we are different from objects, we ought to come into existence differently than how objects do. Objects are manufactured, they're made, they're parts put together by anyone, and it doesn't really matter who, as long as they have the right skills. Subjects ought to come into existence differently. Subjects are relational, communal beings who live or die based on whether we're loved or not. And so we deserve, I would argue, to come into existence through a very physical manifestation of love between two people, namely a husband and wife, as opposed to at the hands of a stranger, a third party who's essentially contracted out by a couple who may or may not actually even be in a loving relationship. But I think this point is really important because some people, particularly in the religious world, might say, okay, look, you've made some great points about it jeopardizing life and killing life. And yeah, there is an ick factor about this commodification culture and, the money exchanged and, the dehumanizing labels and the, checking genetics to see whether someone's fit enough. I mean, that sounds like eugenics. That doesn't sound good. But, and then we'll hear a big but, and someone might say, look, what if you've got a married couple who truly love each other and they don't want to use a sperm seller or an egg seller or a surrogate? They don't want to subject their child to genetic testing. They will accept their child, whether the child is special needs or not. And they won't subject their child to the freezer, and they will just have one or two embryos made and both of them inserted and see what happens. Couldn't that be an ethical form of IVF? And so, in response to that, one of the first points actually that I make is I think you would be hard pressed to find any clinic that would actually be willing to do IVF that way because at the end of the day, IVF, the success of it, in terms of getting people to do it, hinges on success and how many babies actually are brought to term. And you are decreasing your odds tremendously by only making one or two, not subjecting them to testing, and then inserting them. And you're doing it at an incredible expense. So I think the odds are very low that that theory in question could actually in practice be done. But let's entertain that. Let's say you can find someone who'll do that and you can find a couple willing to go to the expense of all of it. I would say we still ought to object to that for three reasons: human error, human endangerment, and the manufacturing of humans. Okay, so human error, human endangerment, and the manufacturing of humans. So in terms of human error, no matter how hard you try to get the right sperm and the right egg and put them together and insert them in the right body, human error is a real thing. And if you type in the internet IVF gone wrong, you will find horror stories of the wrong embryo being made, that not being realized, being inserted into a woman's body. And then when she gives birth, she's like, this baby doesn't look like me, or it doesn't look like my spouse. And it looks dramatically different, like another ethnicity. And then testing is done and you realize, oh, the wrong baby was made. But then what do you do? Because if it's the woman who gave birth egg, but some third party she didn't even know about sperm and not her own husband's sperm, whose baby is it? Does she have to give the baby to the other couple? But it is partially hers. Um, so we create all these moral dilemmas where it even becomes a question of what do we do? Is there shared parental custody? Then there have been cases where the right child has been made but inserted into the wrong woman's body. She gives birth, thinks the child doesn't look like her, does testing and realizes it's not her baby at all. So now she's bonded with the child is bonded with her, and now there is this terrible rupture of the bond, and the child is given, in one sense, rightly to the biological parents, but now the impact of this on the child's life and on that woman's life is profound. And that can still happen even if we narrow the parameters. It might be a low likelihood, but it matters when it comes to human persons. The second thing is there's still a risk of human endangerment. So when you even make one or two babies in the lab, you have one temperature in the lab that goes wrong, or you have a power outage, or you move the pipette wrong and you trip as you're walking, like all these things that can occur that are endangering the lives of the youngest of our kind. But finally, I would say you're still involved in human manufacturing. And one of the things I think we need to ask people, which can seem like an off-topic question, but it actually is very relevant, is to say to someone, why is slavery wrong? If you had to kind of summarize why it's wrong, how would you do it? And the answer would be, well, slavery is wrong because it involves possessing another human, treating that human as if you have a right to them and a right to use them and do with them and own them and do things to them in the way that you want. Slavery is wrong because it involves creating a situation of inequality where you're claiming you are superior and the person you're enslaving is inferior. And all of this is what is happening when we manufacture humans. It's implying that we have a right to a baby, that we can possess another. And as much as we are ordered to become parents within our very biology, we still cannot claim a right to a child, because if we claim a right to a child, then we're implying the child is inferior to us and somehow we can possess them or own them, and we ought not say that about a human person. The other thing we need to think about when thinking about why we should be concerned about manufacturing a human person is that we are made for relationship. We are made for connection and for communion. And in fact, when you deprive humans of those things, when you have solitary confinement, when you have all the isolation that COVID brought about, for example, we see profound devastation amongst human beings. And we see breakdown, we see depression, we see anxiety, we see suicide when you break apart humans from relationship that they were made for. And so I would say if you compare and contrast, for example, the old-fashioned way of making a baby through sexual intimacy versus manufacturing the child through IVF, we see these very different worlds. When it comes to making babies the old-fashioned way, you have to have a communion of persons. You literally have to come together, the male and female. And then when the child comes into existence, the child literally is always in a communion of persons with the mother because they're always coming into existence beneath her heart. And so you have connection, you have coming together, you have a communion of persons. When you manufacture life, you have disconnection, you have fragmentation, you have division and separation. So as much as the woman could be there when the man provides his sperm sample, her presence is not necessary for the sperm sample to be obtained for IVF to occur. So you have separation right there. As much as the man could be there to hold his wife's hand while her eggs are being extracted after they've been harvested, his presence is not necessary for the extraction to occur successfully. And as much as a couple could possibly, although I've never heard of this, request that they stay in the lab the day that fertilization occurs in the petri dish, and they ask that if they can even look through a window in the lab as that is occurring, their presence, their watching is not necessary or essential for the scientists to successfully make fertilization happen. So with IVF, every party is separated. With sexual intimacy, every party is together in a communion of persons. And there is a sense with sexual intimacy that as much as you can time pregnancy down to the greatest likelihood of achieving success, at the end of the day, it's a hands-on and a hands-off process. You know, if a couple is monitoring their fertility, seeing that they ovulate Friday and knowing ovulation was likely, they had sex, let's say, Monday to Saturday, which of those sexual acts ultimately brought about their child? Which sperm? Which egg? We don't know. And there is this sense of, okay, we've done everything that we think is likely to bring about a child, and then we say, will this child come to be? But in the case of IVF, you're contracting out the capacity to bear children, fruit from your loving expression, to a third party external to one's marriage, who's in the business of trying to optimize this and make it as successful as possible. And the child then comes to existence at the hands of a stranger in a sterile lab, as opposed to a fruit of the physical manifestation of a communion of persons. And because we're talking about persons who are subjects and not objects, I really think it matters that we ought not be manufactured and come into existence the way that objects do. So having said all of that, wrapping things up so we can have a nice 30-minute Q&A, what does this mean then for the couple who desperately longs for a child and has that ordered desire? If I ethically object to IVF, am I saying good luck, sorry, it's too bad that you've got your suffering? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. Just because I object to one method of intervention doesn't mean there aren't alternative methods of intervention. So a great world that is coming on the map somewhat, but we need to draw more attention to it, is the world of restorative reproductive medicine. In the pro-life world, this can get all kinds of names. Some people call it Creighton fertility model. Some people call it NAPRO technology. But restorative reproductive medicine is kind of the overarching umbrella, which really captures the idea that at the end of the day, we want to restore the reproductive system to its natural functioning. And if we're talking about the time between puberty and menopause, where someone is not able to get pregnant, then something has gone wrong, either with one or both parties in the sexual relationship. And so why not try to figure out what has gone wrong in order to restore it, so that when the couple comes together in a relationship, in an act of love, in a communion of persons, so that that can possibly create a whole other body and soul, another human person, not an object, but a subject, that we increase the odds of that actually occurring. And so that's where, if you look at IVF, it, at the end of the day, doesn't address if there is a underlying problem. It just kind of counterfeits and creates a whole other approach to making life. So often people can be told, if you have PCOS, you're a candidate for IVF. Well, if you have PCOS, you're also a candidate for ovarian wedge resection surgery. With PCOS, the ovaries the eggs rather having a hard time being released from the ovary because you have a hard leathery skin, and so which is what the ovary is like rather. And so a friend of mine had this surgery where by cutting out a wedge and stretching the skin, making it thinner, the eggs could actually be released through into her fallopian tube, so that when she and her husband came together in a communion of persons, it was more likely that they could conceive. And in the case of friends of mine who had this particular surgery, they've conceived successfully in terms of live births at least 4 times, plus they also had, I believe it was 2 miscarriages. So instead of IVF, we could do ovarian wedge resection surgery. Endometriosis, sometimes people say, well, you can't even get pregnant, or maybe you've had miscarriages. So let's, do IVF, or let's get a surrogate. And instead, why don't we do endometriosis surgery? And there are some phenomenal doctors, including my own, who not only do it, but he has a very special way of doing it. Because sometimes they say, get pregnant right after surgery because you have a small window where you're going to have a greater chance of pregnancy. And he does it a certain way that even extends the likelihood of pregnancy well beyond just initially post surgery. But the point is, do endometriosis surgery. In my own case, I've had 4 miscarriages, 3 of which were in a row. And that makes me also, at my age, I'm now 45. I had my first pregnancy at 40. My first live birth at 41. But that makes me, by the world standards, a candidate for IVF, because people would say, look, based on your age, you probably have poor egg quality. These are probably disabled embryos that are being made. Having 3 miscarriages in a row is indicative of that. So if you did IVF, then we could pick the best embryos, and you could therefore have a successful pregnancy. Well, again, it comes down to, I'm not going to kill some children in order to create others. But as well, it's possible that it's not simply a matter of the children being made having a genetic anomaly. Maybe there's something wrong with my body. And so as a result of having multiple miscarriages, again, 3 in a row, which is significant in terms of indicating a problem. I forget what it's called. You all would know. It's that special saline injection. I think it was anyways, it was, and then they lit up my uterus to try to see if I had fibroids and other things. Well, I didn't. But had I had that, then my doctor was like, well, then we'll do surgery to increase the odds of a successful pregnancy. I also was tested for progesterone. I have low progesterone. So instead of IVF, why not give me progesterone when I'm pregnant? And so I credit my 2 live births, my 2 daughters, as having their lives saved as a result of an excellent restorative reproductive medicine doctor who used progesterone to administer it to me in order to keep my babies alive while I was pregnant. And so the point is, let's look for alternatives that restore the body to its healthy function it should naturally have, so that when 2 people come together in a relationship, in a communion of persons, that is more likely that it could bear fruit. It is not always going to be successful because we live in a broken world, and you know that better than anyone. You can do multiple surgeries and all other aspects of medicine not related to reproductive medicine and still see patients die and still see cancer overtake someone. But we do our best, and we do our best to restore life, but at the end of the day, in a way that reverences the fact that we're dealing with a subject and not an object, a human person who ought to be treated with the sense that they are different and that they are sacred. So there's much more I could say, but I want to leave the last 30 minutes for questions. So I will let Nicole take it from there.